One of my favourite scientific experiments I've read of ever was a test for luck, a scientific investigation into what determines whether someone is lucky or not. And they went and they surveyed a whole bunch of people, and they said, do you reckon that you're very lucky, you're not all very lucky, or you're very unlucky? And then they gave them an experiment where they gave them all newspapers, and they were told they had to cut out all the pictures of women from the newspapers. And every newspaper that they gave them had a big advert, a quarter-page advert on page 3 saying, if you take this out and show it to the experimenter, you will get £25. And the point about the experiment was, pretty much everyone who found it and presented it was a lucky person, or said they were lucky, and pretty much all the people who said they weren't lucky didn't see it. So for anyone who didn't spot the table worth of things, nice things on your way in, I'm afraid you're unlucky people.
What?
Also for anyone who's just watching the video, you missed something, but that's not bribery, that's just a fact. Anyway, welcome. This is the last lecture on political obligation, this Halloween spectacular. There will be at least one Halloween surprise during the lecture. And today we're talking about anarchism. So we're going to start off by looking at philosophical anarchism, which is what we're interested in this time. And we're going to find out why it is that philosophical anarchists don't go around smashing windows and wearing Che Guevara t-shirts, at least not most of the time. We're going to look at some classical anarchists from the 18th and 19th centuries and find out how it was that they subverted traditional arguments for political obligation so that they actually worked against the state rather than in favour of it. We're then going to look at a very radical contemporary anarchist, Robert Wolff, and find out why he thought the state wasn't only unjustified, but why it was inherently unjustifiable. Finally, we're going to meet again a recurring character, John Simmons, who's come up several times in previous lectures, and find out what he actually thinks and why it is that he disagrees with absolutely everyone. And then we're going to look at a few final things. We're going to look at why it is that you don't necessarily have to make choices when you're studying philosophy, but people sometimes give you odd looks if you don't. I'm going to talk a little bit about methodology, and as mentioned last time, I'm really hopeful that we'll get through this material fast enough. There'll be a little bit of space for questions and answers. So what is philosophical anarchism? Well, political obligation is the view, as I've mentioned at the beginning of pretty much every lecture, so I hope this has really sunk into you guys now, that if you are moral, at least according to some conception of what morality is, then you have a special reason to obey the law. This is your political obligation. Philosophical anarchism is merely the denial of political obligation. It is simply the view that moral people have no special reason to obey the law. Does this mean that they don't have to obey the law? No, of course not. Because there are all sorts of other reasons why they would obey the law. They're moral people. And on the whole, the law prescribes immoral things. The law says don't kill each other. You don't actually need the law, as John Rawls was talking about, to persuade you not to do that. If you were contemplating murdering the person sitting next to you, you're already a bad person. Political obligation has nothing to do with that. Then there's also the fact that you would be punished if you murdered the person next to you, or almost certainly you would. This is all being recorded. So that wouldn't be a good idea, because you'd be locked up. Your liberty would be taken away, and you want to avoid that. So for this reason, it's in your self-interest not to disobey the law. But that's not political obligation. And finally, as talking to some of you after the lecture last time, some philosophers say that it's just in your interest to obey the law whether you stand to be punished or not. That being a just person, being somebody who obeys the law, is just good for us. So Plato famously made this Republic. It's the whole point of his longest and most famous dialogue, The Republic, is to argue that if you obey the law, then you will be happier and wiser and a better person with a better life as a result. Hume argued for this. His response after the social contract wasn't to say that he has some other reason for political obligation, but he said that what states do is they prevent us from doing things that may be in our short-term self-interest, but are very much not in our long-term self-interest. So we might feel it's in our short-term self-interest to murder the person who's eating a sweet very annoyingly right next to us. But of course, even if we weren't punished by society, their relatives might come and get us. It wouldn't actually be a good idea in the long run. So they help us escape this problem of being overly concerned about the short term. And John Rawls also comes up with ideas of why being a just person who obeys the law is just good for us. Because it allows us to live in societies that are complex and cooperative and all of these other things. This is not political obligation. These are reasons to obey the law, but they don't stem from the fact that we are moral people. So they're not political obligations. If you want to look for something where the arguments that we're talking about today have a real practical concern, a real practical difference for what you should do as an individual in the here and now, you need to ask yourself the question of, should I obey a law that is immoral, that is not in my self-interest, that's going to harm me, and, that it would harm me if I obey it, and where I stand no chance of being punished. No one's going to find out, no one's going to know, no one's going to over-detect. Now, if I said to you that in these situations you should do the immoral thing that's against your self-interest, even though there will be no bad consequences for you, and you say, well, maybe you shouldn't do that, maybe you don't really have any reason to do that, then you too may be a philosophical anarchist, no matter how much you thought you were a law-abiding, upstanding member of your country. It's not quite that simple. That's the only practical difference that philosophical anarchism would make. There are some more conceptual differences, though. Important differences about how we see ourselves and how we see ourselves in relation to the state, how we think about the state, and how we act as citizens. These aren't really easy to detect, like this is what political obligation tells you, but they seem to follow logically. So if you believe in political obligation, if you've been persuaded by any of the arguments that have been presented, then you think that states are justified, that it's right and proper that we live in states with governments, and that we generally obey the laws of these governments. If, on the other hand, you're a philosophical anarchist, you think that there is no moral reason why states exist. They are amoral entities. They just happened. It would have been no different, certainly no worse, if there had never been states. That would have been fine. And in replying to this, you've got to be careful, because saying things like, oh, well, no, it's a good thing that we have states because we're all much better off having states. Is that then a moral justification? Well, it might be, if you're a sort of utilitarian. You might be saying, and it's good, it's right that everyone's happier. So that would be a sort of, that would be a source of political obligation for you, that you should then uphold the state because it's making people happier. So although the philosophical anarchist position doesn't make much difference on a practical day-to-day level, it does make quite a big difference on how we conceive of our governments and our relation to them, and I'll come back to this shortly. The first set of arguments that we're going to consider for philosophical anarchism all start from the premise that there's something bad or wrong about the state. So the first person to make this argument, at least within English language philosophy, is William Godwin. 18th, early 19th century political writer, author, general all-around rebel and bad boy. Wife of Mary Wollstonecraft. And here comes your spooky Halloween fact. William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft were, of course, the parents of Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, who is better known as Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. So there you go, we're contemporary. Now, he starts from the liberal Whig tradition, right? Locke's famous view. People can live morally in the state of nature. There is a natural law, and we can adhere to it. Godwin thinks that the natural law isn't rights-based like Locke. He thinks it's utility-based. He thinks that the idea is that everyone wants to do what is best for others, make other people happy, make themselves happy, and generally the more happiness in the world, the better the outcome. And we can all perceive this. And he thinks that we can live this because we have some tools that really help us. We have our own inner conscience. We have our sense of sympathy, which makes us feel happy at other people's happiness. We have our communities who will help us to agree informal rules of cooperation. And we have this responsibility, as Locke pointed out, not just to sanction wrongdoing against ourselves, but against other people. And not just to feel shame at our own wrongdoing, but also to generally notice and respond to wrongdoing generally. So we can build these free moral societies, which are him a utility-maximizing societies. But where he differs from Locke, most crucially, is he says, but that wasn't in the past, as Locke said. Locke thought this happened before the state. He says, no, 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 no. That's all in the future. That's what we're heading towards. At the moment, we are in the intermediate state of working this out. So, for instance, for Godwin, He thinks this principle of utility, that what is right with what maximizes the general happiness, this is a new discovery. This is a wonderful new discovery because it brings together our own sense of self-preservation and our own evaluation, our own positive evaluation of happiness in ourselves, our sense of sympathy and care towards others, and our desire to be good people. Traditionally, these three things pointed in very different directions and were mutually non-satisfiable. Now, what Hume showed, and what Godwin shows, is that they don't have to be. They can coalesce. We can achieve all of them together. But only when we're free to do as we choose. Only when we actually live according to our moral precepts and our own sense of sympathy. And we're still working that out. But we will get there. Godwin thought we had a limitless potential to develop morality into the future and to make better and better societies. But he was concerned that we were holding ourselves back. And one of the things that held us back was this sense of obligation to obey the law of the status quo. And that's a mistake. This sense of obligation is not preserving us from a previous bad state of nature. It is preventing us from moving forward and using our own judgment to live even better lives and to make even better choices. And this kind of makes sense, because when you write laws for a country as a whole, you have to write them for general cases. You can't work out exactly what's going to be best in every specific situation. But the individual can. They have information that the lawmaker doesn't. So they will know that sometimes a law that seems like a good idea might be a bad idea, and vice versa. So we shouldn't consent to being governed by these political obligations. They're holding us back. We certainly don't benefit from them because the best society still lies ahead of us. And they're not just. So we don't have any obligations. We don't have any reason. Our reasons are just to be morally good people and to help our societies develop into better societies. Another classical anarchist who says something similar is Kropotkin. We talked about the English Revolution, the French Revolution. He was involved in the Russian Revolution. He was a real hardcore anarchist who inspired many people and did indeed play some role in the October Revolution, although more as a sort of cheerleader and supporter than as a front linesman. He was reasonably old. But he was an exile from Russia for most of his life for his views. He sees it slightly differently. He's not persuaded of this argument of limitless potential to improve, but he thinks human beings in their natural state are actually very cooperative. All sorts of animals, and he did this rather like Hobbes, he's a real scientific guy, did lots of studies of animal behavior, and he showed how all sorts of animals and symbiotic relationships between animals and plants and so on exhibit diverse degrees of cooperation, working together, ensuring common survival. And he also drew on many examples in which individuals show and develop cooperative behavior without the need to have laws or coercive force. And he was doing this at the turn of the 20th century. Actually, in recent times, this has become a very hot topic in political science and political sociology, because this is true. Evolution evolves. Sorry, cooperation evolves. We are not actually driven just by the desire to compete for resources. We often recognize, or even if we don't recognize, we're often driven to cooperate by evolutionary pressures. So if I cooperate with someone, together we do better than we would do separately. Other people seeing us might want to join in our cooperative state or might want to emulate it for their own mutual benefit. Computer scientists now working with AI have shown all sorts of things that had not been previously been thought about where this process can be seen happening in nature. And this is now a very well established fact in political science, in biology, and many other fields. One of the famous examples is that of trench warfare, where soldiers who can't communicate, who are on opposing sides, who are tasked with killing each other, often develop cooperative strategies for preserving one another's lives. Just because those who do survive, and those who don't die. So the cooperators win out and keep on getting sent back to the front. And so cooperation spreads in completely distinct communities. It's an amazing phenomenon. This Kropotkin contrasts with the state, which he says entrenches divisions, inequality, and conflict. His view is it's only the state that makes us feel that we're constantly fighting one another and that we will be lost without the state. But that's a lie. Without the state, we'd be much better off. Godwin and Kropotkin are philosophical anarchists, therefore, but they're also political anarchists. Philosophical anarchists say moral people have no special reason to obey the law. Political anarchists say that moral people have at least some reason to disobey the law, to seek to bring down the state. And that was the view that both Godwin and Kropotkin took. That we would be better off without the state. It's causing us problems. And if you really want to do what's right, you should be working against the state. And so their argument for philosophical anarchism flows through their argument for political anarchism. It's because the state is bad that we're not obliged to obey it. The problem with both of these arguments is that although you can easily cite scientific examples, evidence for where cooperation is naturally promoted and where people do better under cooperation, or for where people using their judgment can indeed perform more moral actions than the law can, this isn't generally true for anarchy. It seems like this is true in the margin, but not in the limit. So in the margin, you make a small difference to people's societies. So, for example, one example is in the management of common pool resources. So, I don't know if any of you have ever heard about the tragedy of the common. So, it's the idea that you have a common grazing ground. Everyone puts their animals on the common to graze and fatten, but then they kill and eat their own animals. They're not done collectively. And people have a general incentive, according to standard economics, to try and graze more animals than their neighbours, because then they'll get more to eat. But if everyone does that, then the grazing gets exhausted, the animals die, they're emaciated, everyone's worse off. In studies, this has been found to be not true. So the standard economic example says the only way of avoiding the tragedy of the commons is either to say, look, everyone should have, you have to allocate property rights so people can pay to graze an additional animal on, but then the money is reallocated or it goes to the owner of the commons or somehow managed so that if you want to graze more animals, you have to pay a higher tariff. Or they say you can have state rules about who can graze what animals when and so on. And those are the only two options according to classical economics. Actually, it's completely the other way around. Those two options both fail terribly. All the successful management of common pool resources are done by community engagement and cooperation. So this is a big tick for Godwin and Kropotkin. But these aren't lawless anarchies. These are examples of people living in states, living in well-ordered communities, who just agree to cooperate on this specific thing, the management of the commons, the management of the fisheries. That's very successful. Similarly to the soldiers. They live in states, they live in armies, they know about law. But in this one example, where you put them both in trenches, they can cooperate to save each other's lives. If you take away all the laws, it goes badly wrong. So they make a mistake in moving from these clear margin examples, where political obligation can seem to cause problems, to the general argument that the state and all laws are wrong. And that just isn't supported by the premise, and people don't rush to go and live in failed states. You know, Hobbes was the guy who knew this most clearly, having lived through the anarchy of the English Civil War. It really isn't that good. You don't have to take this view, though. You can argue for philosophical anarchism on its own grounds, without taking any objection to what the state says. One guy who does this is Robert Wolff. He has a very different kind of argument. He says, we all have our principal obligation, our primary obligation, the thing that we are obliged to do above and beyond everything else, and from which all other moral obligation flows, is the obligation of autonomy. Human beings can make choices, for better or for worse. But it's not only that we can, says Wolff, we also should, must, we are obliged to do that. If we recognise political obligations, we don't make choices. We say, I'm just going to do what the government told me to do. I'm not going to choose myself whether I'm going to murder someone or not. But the government says, don't murder. So I won't murder for that reason. that he says is the wrong reason. It doesn't satisfy this principal obligation to autonomy, because we cease to act autonomously. Just doing what the state says. And so since it violates our principal obligation, it is not an obligation that we have. That renders it void. The only way that we could be obliged to obey the law would be if this obligation to obey the law were made compatible with our principal obligation to autonomy. And the only way that that could happen would be if we all continuously chose that what we were going to do was to obey the laws that we recognize. So it's not that we make, at one point, we give our consent or we recognize we benefit from obeying laws, and then we decide that we're going to be good, upstanding members of society and obey the laws for that reason. You have to be continuously choosing, yep, I'm going to carry on obeying the law. Yes, I'm going to carry on obeying the law, of your own free will. He says, well, then you would be obliged to obey the law. But that's not political obligation. I mean, come on, guys, that's stretching it too far. If you are only obliged to obey the law, if you choose to be obliged to obey the law, you're not obliged to obey the law. The obvious question to ask with Wolff is, why do we have this principal obligation of autonomy? What is it about making our own choices that's so great? From his view, this is just what it means to be a moral agent. You have to choose. And what he links us to is the idea of moral responsibility. If you are a moral agent, then you can be held responsible for your actions. You can be said, yes, you acted rightly. No, you acted wrongly. But you can only do that if you choose to act in a particular way or you don't. You can't hold people responsible for things that they didn't choose to do. So you can't hold people responsible for acting if their sole reason for acting was, well, that's what the law said I had to do. It's not their responsibility. It would then be the state's responsibility for passing a bad law. But that is to fail to recognize that it is your responsibility what you did. You are a moral agent. At least if you want to be a moral agent, you have to act like one. So you have to be held morally responsible. So the way I liken it is, I don't know if any of you had this situation, but you do something that you know you oughtn't, and when you're found out, this is when you're a primary school child, you sort of say, well, my friend told me to do that. I was just doing what I did. Don't punish me, punish him. Right? Your teacher, your mother, no one's going to accept this excuse. It's not just that your friend told you to do something that was wrong, but the fact that your friend told you to do it wasn't a reason to do it. You made a choice to act that way. You didn't act that way because your friend told you to do it. You acted that way because you chose to act that way. You are kidding yourself if you say, no, I was only acting out of obligation to my friend. That's just not what being a moral agent means. So Wolff says the same is true for political obligation. You cannot be a moral person if you also you also pass on responsibility from yourself to the state. So political obligations are like the square circle. They just don't exist. What are some of the objections? This is a very controversial theory. People really love arguing with Wolff because it's such a clear theory. It's such a sort of outlandish theory. You would almost say there's a big literature on this. It's a really good argument to get your teeth into. Why on earth is it that we really do have this? This is our principal obligation, right? Well, maybe we have an obligation to act in a morally responsible way by choosing, but is that really our principal obligation? For instance, aren't we obliged, above and beyond choosing, aren't we obliged to choose right rather than wrong? But as soon as you start saying things like that, the argument actually falls to bits. Because if you say, well, I had to do what was right, then you can say, oh, well, yeah, but what was right in this case was to do what your friend said or what the political state said, right? It's only because he said your primary obligation is just to choose, not to choose what is right or wrong, but just to choose for yourself, that the argument goes through. Yeah, and then the next objection is, okay, so I have to choose, but why is authority handing on responsibility to other people, why is that so utterly opposed to choosing? Don't I choose to act according to someone else's authority? Isn't that, my free choice? Shouldn't I be held responsible for that? And of course, this is particularly important when you consider, young people or people in situations where they have no idea what's going on. How can it not be right in those cases to choose to accept someone else's authority and do what they say? Isn't the fact that it's so unreasonable to say, well, my friend told me to do it when you're caught for stealing or something, that they just weren't the right person for you to be listening to? If you said, well, why did you swallow that pill? And you say, well, my doctor told me to do it. That's, and it turned out that pill, was a legal drug or something, you shouldn't have done it maybe. But that would be a perfectly legitimate explanation. You don't have to know everything about the contents of this pill. If the police tell you to move away from an area, maybe they're being really sinister and involved in some political cover-up. But actually, it would be a real problem if every individual said, well, I've got to find out for myself and make my own choice. No, for public order reasons, this is perfectly legitimate with you preserving your own autonomy to say, okay, he's a policeman, I'm just going to do what he says. And how can we even make sense of the idea of autonomy? Our decisions are not our own. What we do is very much dependent on the people around us. Even if we don't say, well, I wrote all this stuff in my essays because my lecturer told me to do so. That's kind of problematic. But on the other hand, of course, you did, in some ways, because you're students and I'm a lecturer and you're supposed to be learning. I'm having an influence on you, I hope. So, yeah, we're not these perfectly rational agents that moral philosophers often see us as. And Wolff seems to really rely upon that being the case. And then finally, there are some paradoxes that are generated by Wolff's view of autonomy, which other people also take. It's based on the Kantian view of autonomy, I think you'll meet later on. So the idea here is that I can't just make a decision. I have to decide at some point some kind of principles or motives or theories that I'm going to live by. Moral principles, say, or principles of art or whatever. I have to choose to accept those principles. But once I've done that, aren't all my subsequent actions not freely chosen? Do they not follow from those principles that I chose to live by? Or is that not what choosing to live by certain principles is supposed to be all about? So how can I act autonomously? Well, maybe you say, okay, you autonomously chose those principles, but when you chose those principles, you were acting according to previous principles and previous ideas of who you wanted to be and what you wanted to do. All choices, in a way, depend upon previous choices. So why not also the choice at some point to obey political authority? Why is that such a problem? Okay, this is all kind of metaphysical, but I think it's good fun. Anyway, I'm a philosopher, I would be. Last theory, John Simmons. We've met him. He's great. He has sort of the most comprehensive view, I think, of anyone we've studied in political obligation. He gets into every theory and really messes with it and shakes it about and comes up with objections, and often they're exceedingly insightful objections. I very much recommend his book on political obligation to you. Anyway, he has an objection to Wolff. He says, well, okay, so that's fine, Wolff. Let's accept your argument. Let's forget all of these objections. Let's say that you've really shown, in that case, we have no moral obligation to obey the law. But then do we not also have no moral obligation to obey promises or to obey contracts that we signed? Because when we sign the contract, we are denying then our responsibility for what to do next. We're just saying, in this case, I will do this, and in this case, I will do this. And that is also equally abhorrent to, or at least, in the way you put it, well, to your idea of the primary obligation of autonomy. But those aren't objectionable. Do you really want to throw away promising? Simmons certainly doesn't. Simmons bases, when he finally gets to it, he bases his whole idea around promising. Before that, but yeah, it seems that Wolff doesn't want to get rid of promising. So what's the difference? as I said, Simmons is someone who we've met several times. He objects to everything. His view is actually quite different. He is also a philosophical anarchist. But unlike Godwin or Kropotkin or Wolff, he has no argument for philosophical anarchism. People have an argument for philosophical anarchism we call a priori anarchists. They say, I was an anarchist to begin with because of this reason, this argument that you can understand and appreciate that says you have no political obligation. Simmons is an a posteriori anarchist. Posteriori means after the fact. He looked at all the theories that were available and he said, no, these are all really bad theories. So maybe we just don't have any political obligations. I mean, I stand to be corrected. But as far as I can see, says Simmons, the only way that we would have political obligation would be through actual consent. So he needs promising. If we all promised to obey the law, then we would all be obliged to obey the law. But we don't. Well, actually, children do, but they don't count. You shouldn't hold people to minors. You know, we don't spend our lives promising to uphold the law most of the time. And he can't see any other way that you might justify the state and say that people really are obliged to obey the law. That seems fair enough. We certainly have come across objections to every single argument that I put up so far. Why not? Why not say we don't have any obligations? Well, you can't argue against that kind of negative argument. If you don't think that there have been any satisfactory arguments so far, and you can't find any in the literature, there's not a lot you can say. John Horton has something he can say. He says, okay, fair enough. There aren't any of these arguments. But is your position really as acceptable as you think it is? Because after all, you are living in a state. You are living in a country. And it is your country. You would say that. You would believe that. You do obey the laws. You do judge others for obeying the laws and not obeying the laws. And now you're saying there's no moral reason to do any of these things. Is that actually quite a profound thing to say? Is that quite a profound change? Whilst I don't think any of the arguments that we've seen so far are flawless, I hope that at least some of you have come to the conclusion that there's something there. They do seem to be getting at something. We are complicit in our legal and political institutions. We do care about them. We do want to support them. We do benefit from them. And we do recognise that they uphold things that we care about. General well-being, human rights, justice, democracy. Maybe we don't have any of these perfect examples of consent or of benefits that morally require reciprocation or of natural rights. But it does seem like, on balance, there's something there. These theories do seem to be getting at something. So yeah, maybe we don't accept any of them. Maybe Simmons has defeated every argument. But actually, do we really want to follow him from that view to saying, well, if you can't provide me with a flawless argument for why I should obey the law, then I'm going to say I have no obligation? We could say we do have obligations. We don't know why, but we do. That's the end of the reading list, end of everyone who I've got to cover on this course, and the end of the syllabus. Before you go, I wanted to cover two small things. One of them, which I'll come to shortly, is about methodology. How do you, as students, respond to all these arguments and things that we talked about? The other is what seems to me an important position that's not covered on the syllabus, and that I do just want to mention to you, although, as I say, it's not unproblematic in itself. Political obligation rests, our obligation to obey the law, on our acceptance of a certain moral theory. Not all moral philosophers, certainly, and I think this is an increasing view in moral philosophers, say you have to just accept one moral theory. There's a growing acceptance that you can be a pluralist. You can say, well, there's something in utilitarianism. Happiness is good. But there's also something in rights. If I have to violate one of your rights, your basic human rights, in order to increase other people's welfare, maybe I don't do that. But I still have an obligation to increase people's welfare if I don't violate your rights. Maybe I also have more natural duties, deontological duties, other moral principles, virtue theory. Maybe I can even have some vestige of religious ethics. These things do have different prescriptions for what we should do, but they don't have to be incompatible. We can say, well, look, it's just complicated. We are pluralists. We accept lots of different moral obligations. This plays into the argument about political obligation because, as you may have noticed, a lot of the objections to different theories of political obligation rest upon the idea that this moral theory doesn't take us far enough. It doesn't oblige us to obey all laws. It doesn't oblige everyone to obey the law, or it doesn't oblige us to obey the laws of all states. But they can still oblige some people. So, for instance, when Rawls objected to the principle of beneficence, he didn't say that's a bad principle, he kept it. He just said it only applies to political office holders. If you were a moral pluralist then, and you accepted many of these moral theories, might you not say, well, we do all seem to have some obligation to obey the law, but they're not always the same obligations. Maybe, if you're contemplating, do I have a reason to obey the law if it's an immoral law, as we were talking about earlier, this kind of practical, this crunch point of whether you're a philosophical anarchist or not, you might say, well, look, an ordinary citizen doesn't. But if you're a politician or a policeman, you need to do what the law told you to do. You promised it. You have a political obligation, but an ordinary citizen doesn't. Maybe you feel that citizens of liberal democracies have reasons to uphold the law, for natural duty type reasons or human rights type reasons. But actually, in the 18th century, in Locke's and Rousseau's societies, they didn't, because their societies were much worse than ours. They weren't democratic, they weren't just, they weren't liberal, they didn't respect human rights. Maybe there was a cut-off point. Maybe you think new citizens, people who choose to come to a country, or people who choose to do something which gives them special responsibilities or special privileges, they have higher obligations than everyone else. Personally, I find this an attractive view. I think we don't necessarily hold everyone to the same standards. And as I've said, it's based upon pluralism, which is increasingly common amongst moral philosophers. I think it's much less common amongst political philosophers. Broadly speaking, here's why. I mentioned earlier that political philosophy can be seen as in some way supervening upon moral philosophy. And many political philosophers follow Rawls in seeing a very sharp distinction between the two. Rawls was always very clear that he didn't want to get involved in people's moral philosophy, in how they chose to live their own lives. He was only interested in telling people who took many different moral positions how they could get on and build a society that would be good for everyone, and that would be just in how it treated all these different competing worldviews and claims. And lots of political philosophers take that view as well. They say that their view is thin, and that it doesn't want to presuppose that you accept a particular moral theory. It only wants to talk about what the implications for accepting a moral theory are within the political environment. They're also ideal, in that they're not really concerned in what citizens get up to day. They're interested in what they would be obliged, what they would have to do under certain idealized conditions. Pluralism is not a view that makes this kind of thinking very easy, because you have to face trade-offs between different moral theories. You have to say, okay, well, in this case, this theory will win out. In this case, this theory will win out. That's why we accept both moral theories at the same time. It violates thin thinking. It violates ideal thinking. It is messy and complicated. That doesn't seem to be very consistent with the way that political philosophy is done. And I think that's why pluralism is not seen as a kind of third choice that you might accept, if you don't accept any individual argument, but you think that generally they all have something to say. Last slide. I mentioned last week, I pointed out again today, there is a lot of yes but in philosophy. not just in political philosophy or moral philosophy. I'm sure you found the same in your other philosophy lectures as well. You get given an argument, and then immediately they say, and this is why that argument is wrong. It can be quite difficult, and I'm aware, you know, these are your first kind of 4 weeks up at Cambridge, and you're probably for most of your first 4 weeks of philosophy. What on earth do I do? How can I respond when every argument that's being presented to me is wrong? And I certainly had the experience at the end of my first term of being quite depressed by this. And, you know, oh God, we can't say anything. You can say lots of things. There are lots of strategies. Here are my favorites. There aren't the only ones. Just pick one theory and go for it. That's the right theory. Forget everyone else, right? I'm just going to defend this theory. Here are the objections. Okay. Every objection has a counter-objection. You find the counter-arguments. You show why these objections don't tell, or what the special conditions under which the objections fail to hold up. Usually, if you write the objections down clearly, I showed you some tricks how to do this in terms of argument form. Looking at, is it a reductio? Is it an argument where the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises and so on? Pick part of it. You know, is one of the premises mistaken? Is it an invalid argument? Your logic classes should be teaching you how to do this. Just go for it. You'll find it's much easier than you think. Everything in philosophy is wrong, including the people who said that the original people were wrong. The second thing you can do, okay, no theory's right, no theory's infallible, I'm not saying that, but we can still use what we've learned and all these arguments to make theories better. There'll still be objections, that's okay. But this objection, you know, doesn't apply. Or I can take social contract theory, you know, Hume said people don't consent to live in societies. Well, I'm going to improve that. I'm going to come up with new ideas about how consent works that suggests that people do consent. Or, you know, I'm going to bring together the best bits of the consent theory and the beneficence, the fair play theory to try and make them better. And every objection can be a reason for rejecting a theory, but it can also show you how to make that theory better. You can say, okay, we can't even do that, but some theories are more right than others, right? Here are some objections that definitely work. These are the bad boys. You can't get rid of these. And they rule out all these theories. Now, these other theories, they still face some objections, but they're clearly less bad. We've narrowed down the scope of the possible theories. We've pruned out the ones that are clearly wrong. And you don't even need to choose between the theories that are left. Maybe you say, look, I'm actually indifferent between these theories. Any of these theories might be true, right? None of them are fatally flawed. You might say, all of these theories are true. I'm a pluralist. I just accept all of these different principles and we weigh them up in the balance and we can deal with the objections that way. You might just say, and believe me, a lot of philosophy ends up in this, is, I'm just going to leave this up to other people to work out. I've done my bit. Maybe you think all the arguments really are bad. That's fine. You still have several choices. You can come up with a new theory, one that's not on the literature. Objections point out the possibility space in which to work. I've got to come up with a theory and it can't do X, it can't do Y, and it can't do Z. Okay, here's a theory that does none of those things, that faces none of the objections that I've seen. I don't know, maybe there'll be other objections, but at least it survives all of those objections. The final thing, all of these theories fail. There are objections to all of them. There's nothing that can be done. There are no new theories. But here's what we learned in this exercise. Political obligation is not something that's out there as an objective truth, but it's in the minds of all of us. We all just naturally care about it. Maybe we were initiated into that through our education, through our socialization, but we can't just get rid of it. It's part of who we are. That's what we learned from this flawed attempt to come up with the one true theory of political obligation. Any of these would make a good essay. You try and do all of them and you'll have a mess. So do pick one. But there are lots of ways forward. Last thing. Two short stories. After my lecture 2 weeks ago on social contract theory, I went down to London. I went to a rather weird conference where they got a whole bunch of promising-looking academics, mostly sort of Rhodes Scholars and Marshall Scholars and people like that, to a tip for the future, but they allowed a few other people in. And we got lectured at by the great and the good, We had Bill Clinton there, we had Sting there, we had Jeremy Irons there, we had the woman who invented CRISPR there, the guy who invented graphene there. It was a really bizarre thing. Anyway, one of the speakers was Anthony Kennedy, Senior Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States of America. In summary, if you're summing up his short talk to us, he had a 10-minute talk to us, it was, oh, well, the problem is that people don't get involved in how their societies function nowadays. They leave it up to the politicians and to the judges. And that's because we don't teach the social contract in schools anymore. And I was able to say, I do, that's my job. I'm doing a good job. So yeah, if you are an American, apparently you are constitutionally obliged to pay attention to this course. And even if you're not, this is an important thing. Thinking about these things does matter. It matters how you perceive the state around you. It can make a difference. After that, we went on to something that was only slightly less bizarre, which was a group of us from my centre, from the Department of Law. We went and founded a group of MPs who were interested in representing the interests of future generations in Parliament. The first ever all-party parliamentary group for future generations. They were hoping to, they'll run debates and put forward motions and things, and they'll get this stamp and work together and try and make some changes on the things that, at the centre of the state of existential risk, we really care about. But God, if you want to get politicians interested in something, new mention of precedents. The first thing I said that really grabbed them was when I started talking about Burke. The social contract is not a contract between those who are currently living, it's a contract between the people, our ancestors from the past who set up the institution, the present, and those who are yet to come. We're all just guardians of the social contract. They love it. So this stuff really does matter. It is academic. You do need to engage with these methodologies. Please do. But don't forget, philosophy does actually have a point. Kropotkin really did get involved in the Russian Revolution. Rousseau really did inspire the French Revolution. John Locke really did get involved in the English Revolution. These people made a difference. This stuff matters. Thank you very much for paying attention.